War Daddy 2, the Sherman that shattered German confidence. Hook the Desert Wind carried something more than sand that day. Mid-February, 1943, Tunisia. A single American tank sat motionless in the North African heat, its crew long gone. The white star on its hull was already being painted over with the black cross of the Wehrmacht. German officers circled it like surgeons around an operating table. Notebooks out, cameras clicking. This wasn't a trophy. This was evidence. They called it War Daddy 2. And for the next 2 years, this one captured Sherman tank would trigger a crisis that would echo through every tank factory, every proving ground, every desperate battle Germany would fight. Until the bitter end. Because what German engineers were about to discover wasn't just unsettling, it was devastating. They thought they'd built the world's most fearsome tanks. Panthers, Tigers, monsters that could dominate any battlefield with raw firepower and thick armor that American guns couldn't penetrate. But War Daddy 2 was about to teach them something they'd never considered. Sometimes the tank that works beats the tank that's perfect. The Germans were about to learn that lesson the hard way, and by the time they understood it, the war was already lost. February 14th, 1943. Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia. The battle had been chaos. Rommel's forces had smashed into inexperienced American units with the kind of calculated violence that had terrorized Europe for 3 years. Young American tankers, many in combat for the first time, had fought hard. Some had fought brilliantly, but when the smoke cleared, the Germans had the field, and they had something else, something intact. Serial number USA 3067641, built by Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, assigned to Company G, 1st Armored Regiment, 1st Armored Division. An M4A1 Sherman, with its Continental radial engine, still purring when German reconnaissance troops found it. The crew had bailed out. Smart move, probably. Lived to fight another day, but they'd left behind something the Germans desperately needed to see. An enemy they didn't understand yet. Officers from Heavy Panzer Battalion 501 arrived within hours. These weren't ordinary tank commanders. These were men who lived and breathed armored warfare. Men who understood that every captured enemy vehicle was a window into your opponent's soul. Their orders were explicit. Get this tank to Germany. Intact. Operational. Now. A German recon crew climbed into the Sherman's cramped interior. American gauges. American controls. Everything labeled in English. They figured it out quickly enough. The transmission was surprisingly easy to operate. The engine responded smoothly. The whole machine had a solidity to it, a confidence. One of them fired up the engine. It roared to life without hesitation, and then they drove 350 kilometers through desert heat that could cook a man's brain, over sand and rock and terrain that had broken German half-tracks and left panzers overheating on the roadside. 4.5 days of hard driving toward the port at Sfax. The Sherman never complained, never overheated, never threw a track, never coughed or sputtered or showed even a hint of mechanical distress. German tank crews, watching this captured American tank roll past their own vehicles, vehicles that needed constant stops, constant maintenance, constant babying just to keep them moving, felt something uncomfortable settling in their guts. Unease, that engine note was too steady, too reliable, too effortless. This wasn't supposed to happen. German tankers knew their own equipment. They knew that moving a panzer any distance meant careful planning. Frequent mechanical checks. Prayers that the transmission would hold, that the final drives wouldn't shatter, that the engine wouldn't overheat and seize. Yet here came this American tank, captured and driven by men who barely knew how to operate it, crossing hundreds of kilometers of punishing terrain like it was a Sunday drive through the countryside. At Sfax, they loaded War Daddy 2 onto a cargo ship. Destination, Germany. Purpose, comprehensive technical evaluation at the Army's primary proving ground. The voyage across the Mediterranean gave Wehrmacht engineers time to prepare. Intelligence reports had been trickling in about American tank production, numbers that seemed impossible. Factories churning out Shermans by the thousands. An entire industrial nation geared for war production at a scale Germany couldn't match. But numbers on paper were abstract, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. A physical tank. That was real. That was evidence you could measure, test, and analyze. And if the early observations from Tunisia were accurate, if this American tank really was as reliable as it seemed, then Germany had a problem far bigger than anyone wanted to admit. Spring, 1943, Brandenburg, Germany. The rail car rolled to a stop at the Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, 25 kilometers south of Berlin. This was where Germany tested everything, where precision-minded engineers measured, documented, and analyzed every weapon system the Reich produced and every weapon system they captured from the enemy. War Daddy 2 was offloaded carefully. The Germans had already given it official designation: Panzer 259, captured tank 259, license plate WH058941 for administrative purposes. Before it even moved under its own power, test engineers swarmed over it. They painted measurements directly onto the armor. Thickness readings, angle calculations. Every surface became a canvas of white stenciled numbers and technical notations. They photographed it from every angle. Dozens of shots, hundreds. The turret, the hull, the suspension, the tracks, close-ups of welds, detailed shots of hatches and vision ports and every mechanical linkage. This wasn't just curiosity. This was German engineering thoroughness applied to understanding an opponent who shouldn't have been this competent. The initial inspection teams arrived in waves. Powertrain specialists, armor experts, weapons evaluators, automotive engineers. Each group brought their own instruments, their own protocols, their own expertise, and each group came away unsettled. The transmission drew attention immediately. German tankers opened the access panels and just stared. Where German tanks used straight-cut gears, precise, expensive, prone to breakage, the Sherman had herringbone-cut gears, helical teeth that distributed stress across multiple contact points simultaneously. This wasn't exotic technology. This was standard American automotive practice. They'd been manufacturing these gears since the 1930s. Every decent American car had them. Every truck. Every piece of civilian equipment that needed to survive hard use. German manufacturers had considered herringbone gears too difficult to mass produce. The tolerances, the tooling requirements, the specialized training workers would need. Yet here they were, in an American tank, built by the thousands. One engineer ran his fingers over the gear teeth. How many of these did they make? The reports say nearly 50,000 tanks. Someone else answered. All types, most of them Shermans. A long silence followed. 50,000 tanks with transmissions this well engineered. That wasn't just production capacity. That was industrial maturity on a scale Germany had never achieved. The testing protocols began in earnest. They drove War Daddy 2 through obstacle courses designed to break things. Steep climbs, sharp descents, pivot turns, long-distance endurance runs, high-speed dashes, slow, grinding, low-gear torture tests. After each trial, they disassembled components, checked for wear, measured clearances, looked for stress fractures, inadequate lubrication, design weaknesses, anything that would explain how this tank worked so reliably. The data kept coming back wrong, not wrong as in inaccurate. Wrong as in contradicting everything German tank doctrine assumed about the necessary trade-offs between performance and reliability. The Sherman wasn't just adequate. It was excellent in the one metric that mattered most on a battlefield. It worked when you needed it to work. The deeper they dug, the more uncomfortable the discoveries became. The transmission had 5 forward speeds and 1 reverse. Gears 2 through 5 were synchronized. That meant no double clutching, no careful throttle management, no specialized driver training to avoid grinding gears and destroying the transmission. Any soldier with basic driving experience could operate this tank. It was nearly as easy to drive as a civilian car. German tankers, by contrast, spent weeks learning complex double-clutching techniques, learning precise throttle control, learning how to shift without destroying the unsynchronized gears that powered their panzers. The Sherman's designers had assumed that ordinary soldiers, farm boys and factory workers and kids fresh out of high school would drive these machines, so they'd made them easy to drive. German designers had assumed highly trained specialists would be available, so they'd built tanks that required specialists. One approach worked in the real world. The other looked good on paper. The Continental R975 radial engine was another revelation. American aircraft engine, adapted for tank use. 9 cylinders arranged in a circle. Air-cooled, simple, robust. German engineers ran it through temperature extremes, desert heat, winter cold, rapid cycling. Sustained high-load operations, the engine just kept running. Consistent power delivery across conditions that would have caused German engines to overheat, lose power, or seize entirely. The cooling system was almost insultingly simple. No exotic solutions, no complex engineering. Just straightforward design that worked efficiently under real-world conditions. The air filtration system had survived North African sand without clogging. German tanks in Africa had suffered constant filter problems, sand getting into engines, premature wear, frequent maintenance just to keep them breathing. The Sherman's solution wasn't complicated. It was just well designed, thought through, tested, refined through practical experience. Every system reflected the same philosophy: practical functionality over theoretical perfection, and it was working. June 6th and 7th, 1943, Hillersleben Artillery Range, Albert Speer arrived in an official convoy. Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production. The man personally responsible to Hitler for Germany's weapons output. The man who needed to know urgently what American industry could produce and how German designs measured up. The demonstration was carefully orchestrated. Multiple tanks on display. German and captured Allied vehicles lined up for comparison testing. Hill climbing trials. Mobility assessments. Performance under stress. War. Daddy 2 sat alongside Germany's finest. A brand new Panther AOSFD, fresh from production. The latest in German medium tank technology. And a Ferdinand tank destroyer. 65 tons of mobile artillery. The most advanced armored fighting vehicle Germany had designed. Senior Wehrmacht officers gathered. Industrial leaders, engineers, all the men responsible for Germany's armored warfare capability. They were about to see something that would haunt them. The test slope rose at a challenging angle, steep enough to stress powertrains, long enough to reveal endurance problems. War Daddy 2 went first. The Sherman climbed smoothly. Its synchronized transmission shifted without drama. The engine maintained steady power throughout the ascent. The driver handled it confidently, almost casually. No struggle, no hesitation. Just competent, reliable performance. At the top, the Sherman sat idling, waiting. The Panther went next. 700 horsepower from its massive Maybach HL230 engine. Superior power-to-weight ratio on paper. This should have been easy. It struggled. The driver fought the transmission. The engine labored. The massive tank barely made it to the top, arriving with far more difficulty than the lighter Sherman had shown. Speer watched in silence. His face revealed nothing, but the officers around him shifted uncomfortably. Then came the Ferdinand. 65 tons. Electric transmission. The most sophisticated drive system Germany had engineered. A technical marvel that should have demonstrated German engineering superiority. Halfway up the slope, it stalled. Just stopped. The engine died. The electric motors went silent. 65 tons of immobile steel sat blocking the test range, while recovery crews scrambled to figure out what had gone wrong. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Senior officers and industrial leaders stood watching this catastrophic failure play out before dozens of witnesses. The embarrassment was suffocating. Speer didn't react visibly. He was too skilled a politician for that. But he was watching, recording, understanding. Years later, in his memoirs, Speer would write about Sherman capabilities with the kind of grudging respect that comes from seeing your assumptions shattered. He'd personally inspected Italian battlefields in October 1944, seen the terrain, talked to German commanders. The reports about Sherman cross-country mobility had been very favorable, he'd write. The tank could climb mountains that German tank experts had considered inaccessible to armored vehicles. The Sherman had a very powerful motor in proportion to its weight giving it cross-country mobility on level ground that was definitely superior to German tanks. The 26th Panzer Division had specifically reported this American advantage. Not just once, repeatedly, the Shermans could go places German tanks couldn't, move faster, keep moving longer, performance that actually mattered on a battlefield. A public assessment appeared in Das Reich newspaper on June 27, 1943, carefully worded for propaganda purposes. Can't sound defeatist, can't admit weakness, but even the propaganda couldn't fully hide the truth. The article called the Sherman one of the special accomplishments of the North American laboratories, a praiseworthy product of the North American steel industry. It mentioned the serial construction quality, the fulfillment of what it called the almost arrogant requirements of the North American automobile industry. Arrogant requirements. That phrase revealed everything. Americans expected their machines to work reliably, expected them to function without constant maintenance, expected ordinary mechanics to service them with basic tools and common sense. The article even mentioned the gyro-stabilized gun, something no other nation had achieved. American innovation in fire control that allowed shooting on the move with unprecedented accuracy. These public statements, sanitized for German consumption, concealed something far more alarming, spreading through German engineering departments. American tanks weren't just adequate competitors, they were fundamentally better engineered for the realities of mechanized warfare. Back at Kummersdorf, systematic testing continued through summer and autumn of 1943. The engineers were building a database. Evidence. Cold. Hard numbers that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. They measured operational range, pushed War Daddy 2 to its limits, drove it until something should have broken. 2,000 kilometers before requiring major maintenance, they measured transmission efficiency, power losses through the drivetrain. The Sherman's synchronized manual transmission delivered power more efficiently than any comparable German system. They examined gear-changing smoothness. No double clutching required. No careful rev matching. Just straightforward operation that any competent driver could master. And then they examined the final drives. This was where German tanks had been failing catastrophically. The final drives, the gear assemblies that transmitted power from the transmission to the drive sprockets, were breaking under stress. Panthers were being abandoned in the field after less than 100 kilometers because their final drives had shattered. The problem was endemic, inherited from the Tiger design. Straight-cut gears in housings that couldn't handle the loads imposed by a 45-ton vehicle. German mechanics across North Africa and the Eastern Front had been reporting these failures for months. Final drives breaking, Panthers immobilized, vehicles abandoned because they couldn't move. The Sherman's final drives used the same herringbone gear principle as its transmission. They almost never failed. German engineers tested them under sustained combat load conditions that would have destroyed Panther components within days. The Sherman final drives just kept working. Restoration projects decades later would find Sherman final drives that needed no mechanical restoration after years of storage. Design margins that exceeded requirements by enormous factors. Overbuilt to a degree that German engineers would have considered wasteful, but that waste meant the Sherman kept moving when German tanks didn't. By late 1943, the comprehensive report started circulating through Wehrmacht technical branches. These weren't public documents. These were internal assessments for senior officers and armaments ministry officials. The conclusions were sobering. The Sherman demonstrated American automotive engineering, maturity that Germany fundamentally lacked, despite German theoretical knowledge, despite scientific expertise, despite precision manufacturing capability. Americans had figured out something the Germans hadn't. Mass production techniques that allowed looser tolerances. Tolerances that would be considered sloppy by German precision standards, yet resulted in more reliable vehicles that functioned better under field conditions. Interchangeable parts that meant field repairs could be accomplished with basic tools and minimal specialized training. German vehicles required factory-level precision and specialized equipment for many repairs. A design philosophy that prioritized keeping vehicles operational rather than achieving theoretical performance maximums that looked impressive in specifications, but couldn't be maintained in combat. The truth was becoming unavoidable. Internal German engineering assessments began documenting something that went beyond simple production numbers, something deeper, more fundamental. American automotive engineering reflected decades of civilian industry experience that Germany had never developed at comparable scale. Before the war, the United States had widespread automobile ownership. Cars were commonplace. Working-class families owned them. Farmers owned them. Ordinary Americans from all economic backgrounds drove automobiles regularly, maintained them. Understood them? Germany? Cars remained luxury items, status symbols for the wealthy and party elite. The Volkswagen program, the people's car promised to German workers since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 civilian vehicles by 1939. This vast difference in automotive industry maturity translated directly into tank design philosophy. Americans built tanks that mechanics with civilian automotive training could maintain, using skills they already possessed, tools they already understood, principles they'd learned working on cars and trucks and farm equipment. Germans built tanks that required specialist training, constant expert attention from personnel with years of specific military technical education. One approach scaled, the other didn't. The comparison with German tank reliability became impossible to ignore as field reports accumulated through late 1943 and early 1944. Panthers required strict operational restrictions just to prevent mechanical failures. Drivers received explicit instructions not to change gears frequently. Excessive shifting damaged the transmission. Third gear broke so often that field manuals warned against using it except when absolutely necessary. Panthers couldn't turn while backing up. The transmission would destroy itself. Pivot turns were only possible when ground resistance was equal on both tracks, severely limiting tactical flexibility. Foreign objects entering the running gear could jam the drive sprocket. Hours of maintenance to clear a single obstruction. These problems existed despite Panthers being built in dedicated tank factories by skilled workers, using the best materials Germany could provide. The Sherman, by contrast, had been designed by automotive engineers at General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, companies that had been building cars and trucks for decades, applying mass production principles they'd refined through years of civilian manufacturing. The tank incorporated commercial automotive components wherever possible, leveraging existing supply chains, existing manufacturing expertise. The transmission came from multiple manufacturers: Caterpillar Tractor, Buick, Ford Motor Company, all building to identical specifications with fully interchangeable parts that could be mixed freely without adjustment. This standardization, routine in American automotive industry, remained largely theoretical in German tank production. Each manufacturer introduced subtle variations that prevented true parts interchangeability. German mechanics couldn't just grab any spare part. They needed the right part from the right factory batch, the right tolerance range, the right variation. American mechanics pulled a transmission from one Sherman and installed it in another. No modifications, no adjustments. It just worked. Additional captured Shermans arrived at Kummersdorf through 1943 and 1944, tanks taken from British units in Italy, Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. Each captured vehicle underwent similar testing protocols. The database grew. The evidence accumulated. The British had modified some Shermans with their 17-pounder anti-tank gun, creating the Firefly variant that addressed the Sherman's main weakness in firepower against heavy German armor. German engineers examined these modified tanks with particular interest. That massive 17-pounder gun, significantly larger than the standard Shermans, 75-meter fit into the turret with minimal modification. The Sherman's large turret ring had accommodated a major armament upgrade without requiring a complete vehicle. Redesign. Growth potential built into the original design. The Panther, rushed into production to counter Soviet T-34 tanks, had no such capacity. Significant armament upgrades would require complete turret and vehicle redesign. The Panther was maxed out from the start. The automotive testing program expanded to include reliability trials specifically designed to replicate combat conditions. Engineers drove Shermans through hundreds of kilometers of cross-country movement, recording every mechanical incident, every maintenance requirement, every component failure. They compared these results with field reports from Panther and Tiger units operating on the Eastern and Italian fronts. The numbers told an unambiguous story. Panther. Operational readiness. Averaged below 40% through most of 1943. Some units reported catastrophic rates as low as 20 to 25%. Individual Panther battalions documented periods when fewer than 1 in 5 tanks were actually capable of combat operations. By comparison, Sherman tanks maintained substantially higher operational availability across all theaters. Field reports from German Panther units documented the reliability problems in devastating detail. July, 1944, Operation Citadel at Kursk, Panthers, achieved only 16% operational readiness. Mechanical failures eliminated more tanks than enemy action. December, 1943, 37% operational February. 1944, 37% operational. April, 1944, 50%. Operational to May 1944. Finally, reached 78% operational. These figures represented the percentage of Panthers that were actually capable of combat operations on any given day. The remainder? Broken down, awaiting parts, undergoing repairs. The progression showed gradual improvement as design flaws were addressed, but even the best Panther readiness rates never matched what Shermans achieved from initial production. By December 1943, the pattern had become undeniable. Sherman diesel variants achieved engine lifespans exceeding 3,000 kilometers under proper maintenance. Panther engine lifespan barely reached 1,000 kilometers, even after improvements addressed the worst early problems. German reports from March 1944 documented that improved Panther engines achieved service life of 700 to 1,000 kilometers. They presented this as a success, a breakthrough. This improvement merely brought Panther engines to roughly 1/3 of Sherman diesel capability. Sherman transmissions required minimal maintenance between overhauls. Synchronized gears made driver error less likely to cause damage. Panther transmissions demanded constant attention and frequent repair. Third gear failures were so common that drivers learned to skip from second gear directly to fourth gear just to avoid using the problematic ratio. Sherman final drives operated reliably under conditions that routinely destroyed Panther. Final drives within 100 to 200 kilometers of operation. The evidence was overwhelming. Field reports from German units using captured Shermans reinforced the Kummersdorf. Testing data with real-world operational experience, German mechanized units, desperate for reliable vehicles as their own tank inventory degraded, eagerly employed any captured American tanks they could obtain intact. Unlike Soviet T-34 tanks, which Germans extensively modified before use, Shermans entered German service without changes. They didn't require modification. They worked correctly as designed. No fundamental flaws that needed correction. German tank crews who had experienced multiple mechanical failures in their own vehicles found the Sherman's reliability remarkable. They commented on it frequently in letters home, in unit reports, in conversations captured by Allied intelligence. Reports from panzer regiments noted that Sherman operators could focus on tactical considerations and combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, Panther and Tiger crews constantly worried about reaching the battlefield without breakdown. Completing missions before mechanical failure immobilized their vehicles. The 10th SS Panzer Division captured 12 M4A3 Shermans at Hatten-Rittershofen in January 1945 during Operation Nordwind. These tanks had belonged to the American 43rd Tank Battalion, captured intact when their crews abandoned them during the German assault. The 12 Shermans were formed into the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment. They served in combat operations for the remainder of the war. these weren't just trophy vehicles. They were assigned to reconnaissance roles and mobile reserves, positions that required sustained movement without maintenance stops. Reliable mechanical performance under stress. German commanders recognized what Kummersdorf testing had proven years earlier. American tanks could be relied upon to function when needed. That dependability more than firepower or armor. Protection determined tactical utility. In the final months of the war, a Sherman arriving at the battlefield with an operational gun was infinitely more valuable than a Panther with superior firepower, broken down 20 kilometers behind the lines. January 1944 brought expanded testing programs as Wehrmacht forces retreated across multiple fronts and additional captured. Equipment reached Kummersdorf. Engineers examined the M4A1 with the Continental R975 radial engine, documented its characteristics, compared it to other variants. They tested the M4A2 with twin General Motors 6046 diesel engines, noted its superior fuel efficiency and different operating characteristics. They evaluated the M4A3 with the Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine. American crews considered this the best Sherman power plant. Every ODCT variant demonstrated the same fundamental characteristic. Excellent automotive reliability derived from sound engineering principles and quality manufacturing processes. The consistency across variants impressed German engineers. They were accustomed to significant quality variations between different manufacturers producing nominally identical vehicles. The diesel-powered M4A2 particularly impressed the Kummersdorf evaluation. Teams, Soviet forces received 402 of these tanks through Lend-Lease. Significant numbers fell into German hands during retreats on the Eastern Front. The twin GM 6046 diesel engine provided performance, matching any Sherman variant while consuming substantially less fuel than gasoline engines. A critical advantage as German fuel supplies dwindled, German designers had experimented with diesel tank engines, abandoned the effort due to manufacturing difficulties and the complexity of fuel injection systems. American industry produced diesel Shermans alongside gasoline variants without disrupting production schedules, demonstrating manufacturing flexibility and technological sophistication that German industry never achieved during wartime conditions. March 1944 brought reports from General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops. He noted in official communications that improvements to Panther reliability had achieved what he termed acceptable standards by early 1944. Engine life had reached 700 to 1,000 kilometers. Final drive problems had been largely resolved through design modifications and improved manufacturing processes. This improvement presented as significant success in German military communications merely brought Panther reliability to a level Sherman had achieved from initial production in 1942. The German army celebrated reaching standards that American tanks had exceeded from the beginning. How far behind had German armored vehicle development fallen? The comparison grew more painful as German tank production struggled with increasing resource shortages and Allied strategic bombing. Allied bombing campaigns targeted key bottlenecks in the Panther and Tiger production chain with increasing effectiveness. The Maybach engine plant in Friedrichshafen suffered severe damage from Royal Air Force Bomber Command on the night of April 27, 28, 1944. The raid involved 322 aircraft. Imperial War Museum archives describe it as the most damaging raid on German tank production of the entire war. TAEM attack also destroyed the ZF gearbox factory adjacent to the engine plant. Production of tank engines and transmissions halted completely for 6 months. When production finally resumed in November 1944, quality control had degraded significantly. Slave labor, increasingly employed in German tank factories as German workers were conscripted for military service, introduced deliberate sabotage. Cigarette filters jammed in oil passages, gaskets installed incorrectly, components assembled without proper clearances, These problems never affected Sherman production, safely located in American factories, far from any combat zone, staffed by motivated workers earning good wages under decent conditions. The fundamental difference between American and German tank production wasn't engineering knowledge, it was industrial capability, underlying design philosophy. German engineers understood automotive principles as well as their American counterparts, possessed extensive theoretical knowledge, scientific expertise. They simply never applied those principles consistently to tank design, instead prioritizing other factors. German tanks emphasized performance characteristics that made for impressive specifications but poor reliability in field conditions. The Panther's powerful 75mm KWK 42 gun and thick frontal armor came at the cost of an overtaxed powertrain that couldn't reliably support the vehicle's 45-ton weight. The Tiger's formidable capabilities demanded complex maintenance procedures and frequent repairs by highly trained specialists. These trade-offs might have been acceptable if German industry could produce enough vehicles and enough spare parts to maintain them. It could not, particularly as Allied bombing intensified and raw material shortages worsened. American engineers trained in automotive mass production through decades of civilian industry experience designed tanks that could be manufactured by the tens of thousands, maintained by mechanics with basic training. Using skills learned in civilian life, the Sherman powertrain used components proven in commercial service. Design principles borrowed directly from automobile and truck manufacturing. The electrical system included a backup generator that could power turret traverse even when the main engine stopped, a feature that seemed like unnecessary luxury to German designers but proved invaluable in combat. German tankers could only dream of such conveniences, particularly those who'd experienced their turret traverse failing when engines stalled on slopes. These features didn't appear in German technical specifications because German designers had never considered them high priorities compared to armor, thickness, and gunpowder. By spring 1944, Wehrmacht units on all fronts reported increasing mechanical problems as manufacturing quality degraded and spare parts became increasingly scarce. Panthers required transport by rail for movements exceeding 100 kilometers because their final drives couldn't survive sustained road. Marches. Field commands issued explicit orders restricting Panther movement, preserving the vehicles for actual combat rather than losing them to mechanical failure during approach. Marches. The Berger Panther recovery vehicle built on a Panther chassis specifically to recover. Disabled Panthers shared the same reliability problems as the tank it was supposed to recover. German commanders faced grim reality. Mechanical failures eliminated more tanks than enemy action. Some units reported that 70% of tank losses were due to breakdowns rather than combat damage. Meanwhile, Sherman production continued at unprecedented rates that German industry could never match. American factories produced 49,324 Sherman tanks during the war, more than all German tank production of all types combined. British Commonwealth forces received thousands through Lend-Lease. Soviet Union received over 4,000 diesel variants. Chinese forces in Burma used Shermans to devastating effect against Japanese armor that was technologically inferior to both American and German designs. Every theater where Shermans served confirmed what Kummersdorf testing had revealed. Properly maintained, Shermans kept running under conditions that would disable or destroy German tanks. German tank crews who captured and used Shermans universally praised their automotive excellence. In letters, reports, post-war interviews. Reports from the Eastern Front noted that German mechanics found even the complex Chrysler A57 multibank engine, with its 5 separate engine blocks, easier to troubleshoot compared to German tank engines that required specialized knowledge and equipment. The Ford GAA V8, praised by Allied crews for its exceptional reliability and power output, seemed remarkably dependable to German mechanics accustomed to Maybach engines that required constant adjustment of valve clearances, ignition timing, and carburetor settings. The General Motors. Twin diesel, which the US Army had rejected as less reliable than gasoline engines and relegated to Lend-Lease production, far exceeded the performance and reliability of any diesel engine German industry had produced for tank applications. The Sherman's generous design margins provided another advantage that German engineers came to appreciate. The basic transmission and final drive components originally specified for the 30-ton M4 with 400 horsepower required no major modification to handle the 42-ton M4A3E2 jumbo assault tank with its significantly increased armor protection, the same components that powered the standard Sherman successfully transmitted 650 horsepower from experimental engines without failure or need for reinforcement. German engineers calculated that such overbuilding represented waste, excess capacity that increased production cost and used scarce materials without immediate benefit. American engineers understood that the margins provided growth potential for future upgrades and battlefield reliability that made the extra investment worthwhile over the vehicle's service life. By summer 1944, German tank commanders facing the Allied invasion in Normandy knew their technical disadvantages extended far beyond individual tank capabilities. American artillery superiority, devastating close-air support, overwhelming logistical capacity. These combined to overwhelm German forces regardless of tank specifications or tactical prowess. But the Sherman's reliability meant American armored units could sustain continuous operations that German panzer divisions simply could not match. American tank battalions could launch attacks, sustain combat operations, conduct pursuits, immediately prepare for the next operation without extensive maintenance halts. German panzer divisions had to carefully husband their limited operational vehicles, calculating that every movement consumed precious remaining component life and brought mechanical failure closer. The difference in operational availability determined which force could maintain offensive pressure and which had to carefully ration its limited combat power. German use of captured Shermans in combat operations provided final proof of American automotive superiority from the German perspective. The 150th Panzer Brigade, formed specifically for infiltration operations during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, attempted to obtain captured American vehicles to disguise their operations. German planners wanted Shermans specifically. Because of their reputation for reliability, the brigade received only 2 Sherman tanks. Only one proved serviceable enough for operations. That serviceable Sherman never actually saw combat. Massive traffic jams prevented the infiltration operation from achieving its objectives, but the choice was revealing. In an operation requiring vehicles to function without breakdowns while operating behind enemy lines far from any support, only American equipment offered reasonable chances of success. German tanks, even when fully operational, couldn't guarantee the sustained performance such missions required. January 23, 1945, a meeting of the Panzer Commission produced a report that documented catastrophic final drive failures across all German tank types. The document's findings were devastating. Prior to the 1945 Eastern Offensive, there were 500 defective final drives in the Panzer IV, 370 in the Panther, roughly 100 in the Tiger. Additionally, approximately 200 failures had been reported in the Hetzer tank destroyer, based on the Czech 30 Itabita chassis. General Wolfgang Tomele, General Lieutenant and Chief of Staff of the Inspector General of Panzer Troops, serving under Guderian, explained the operational impact in stark terms. In such circumstances, orderly utilization of tanks was simply impossible. The troops lost confidence in their vehicles and in some situations abandoned whole vehicles just because of final drive problems, fearing they would be stranded and captured. German tanks, built to intimidate through impressive technical specifications, failed in the most fundamental requirement of armored vehicles: mechanical reliability sufficient to reach the battlefield and complete missions. Kummersdorf, testing facility, prepared for evacuation in early 1945 as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Engineers frantically packed testing data, shipped documentation to facilities farther west, hoping to preserve technical intelligence for post-war analysis. Some of the captured tanks, including at least 2 Shermans, were pressed into improvised service with combat units desperately defending the approaches to Berlin. These vehicles fought alongside German designs in the final desperate battles, providing one last comparison under actual combat conditions. The Shermans continued operating until destroyed by enemy fire or abandoned when fuel supplies ran out. The German tanks, Panthers, and the few remaining Tigers broke down from mechanical failures at rates that shocked even experienced crews accustomed to poor reliability. One last lesson. Delivered too late to matter. The story of war. Daddy 2 and the dozens of other Shermans tested at Kummersdorf represents one of the great industrial disparities of World War II. German engineers, working within an industrial system that prioritized theoretical perfection over practical utility, produced tanks that looked impressive on paper but failed in sustained field operations. American engineers, applying decades of automotive manufacturing experience to military requirements, produced tanks that lacked technical sophistication in many areas but worked reliably under conditions that defeated German equipment. In armored warfare, as in most military operations, the weapon that functions when needed beats the weapon that might be theoretically superior if it could reach the battlefield and complete its mission. Post-war analysis by American and British intelligence organizations confirmed what German testing at Kummersdorf had revealed. Systematic examination of destroyed German tanks found mechanical failures as common as combat damage as causes of loss. Final drives broken from stress. Transmissions seized from inadequate lubrication or operator error. Engines burned out from overheating or oil starvation. The German obsession with individual vehicle superiority and impressive specifications had blinded them to the critical importance of reliability and maintainability. They built tanks that no conscript mechanic could maintain without extensive specialized training, powered by engines that demanded constant expert attention from skilled technicians, supported by a logistics system that collapsed under the accumulated strain of supplying countless unique parts to scattered units. The lessons learned through testing at Kummersdorf directly influenced German tank design thinking in the post-war Bundeswehr of West Germany. When the Federal Republic began developing the Leopard 1 main battle tank in the 1950s, designers consciously emphasized reliability and maintainability over pure performance specifications. They studied American automotive engineering principles, deliberately applied them to military vehicle development. The resulting Leopard 1 tank incorporated many design philosophies that had made the Shermans successful. Robust powertrain with substantial design margins, easy maintenance requiring minimal specialized tools, standardized components enabling rapid field repairs, growth potential allowing future upgrades without complete redesign. The Leopard 1 became one of the most successful tank designs of the Cold War era, serving with numerous armies, remaining in production for decades. The captured Shermans at Kummersdorf, including War Daddy 2 with its distinctive name still painted on the hull, represented far more than enemy equipment brought home for technical examination. They were tangible proof that industrial maturity and sound engineering principles based on practical experience mattered more than theoretical technical innovation pursued without regard to manufacturing reality. German tank designers pursued advanced specifications because they believed superior technology could overcome material disadvantages and numerical inferiority. They were wrong. American tank designers built reliable vehicles because they understood, through hard experience, that logistics, maintenance capability, and sustained operational availability determined victory in modern mechanized warfare. They were right, and their approach proved decisive. The reliability gap between Sherman and German tanks influenced not just tactical armored warfare, but fundamentally shaped broader understanding of military industrial capacity and its decisive role in modern conflict. Germany entered World War II with technical advantages in many weapon systems, possessing scientific knowledge and engineering expertise that exceeded most opponents. However, Germany lacked the industrial depth and manufacturing sophistication to maintain those advantages through sustained mass production while simultaneously fighting enemies on multiple fronts. The United States entered the war with weapons that were less technically sophisticated in many respects, but possessed industrial capacity to manufacture them in overwhelming quantities while continuously improving quality, reliability, and performance based on combat feedback. This industrial approach, perfectly exemplified by Sherman tank design and production, proved far more effective than German technical sophistication applied to small-scale production. The United States produced nearly as many Sherman tanks as Germany produced tanks of all types combined, while also producing enormous quantities of every other weapon type, supplying allies through Lend-Lease, and maintaining the highest standard of living among all combatant nations. This economic performance, impossible to match for Germany, even before strategic bombing intensified, decided the war's outcome as certainly as any battle. The mathematics were simple, brutally clear when examined objectively. A Sherman with a 75mm gun that reliably reached the battlefield and fought effectively was infinitely more valuable than a Panther with a superior gun that broke down before engaging the enemy or required 3 days of maintenance for every day of operations. A tank battalion with 80% of its vehicles operational could execute missions that a battalion with 40% operational vehicles simply could not attempt. Reliability wasn't just a convenience factor or secondary consideration. It was the foundation of operational effectiveness, determining whether armored units could execute their assigned missions. German tanks consistently failed this fundamental test throughout the war. American tanks consistently passed it. Kummersdorf. Testing had proven this beyond any reasonable doubt by mid-1943. Even as German commanders continued deploying Panthers and Tigers that looked fearsome and possessed impressive specifications but couldn't be relied upon to function when needed most. The Sherman tank didn't win World War II through technical superiority in firepower or armor protection. It won through industrial superiority expressed as mechanical reliability, consistent availability, and ease of maintenance. German engineers at Kummersdorf understood this by mid-1943 based on their exhaustive testing. They wrote detailed reports documenting their findings. They tested the evidence repeatedly with scientific rigor. They reached the correct conclusions about American advantages. But understanding a problem and solving it are fundamentally different challenges. German industry lacked the capacity to retool production around reliability principles while simultaneously fighting a losing war on multiple fronts against enemies with superior resources. American industry had built reliability into its civilian automotive sector over decades of commercial competition and simply extended those mature principles to military production with remarkable success. War. Daddy 2, that single Sherman. Tank captured in Tunisia and tested exhaustively at Kummersdorf for months, told the entire story through its mechanical reliability and consistent performance. Every kilometer it drove without failure was evidence that German tank design had taken a fundamentally wrong path by prioritizing specifications over reliability. Every test that demonstrated American automotive excellence was proof that industrial maturity and practical manufacturing experience mattered more than theoretical performance calculations. Every comparison between Sherman and German tank reliability proved that Americans had solved problems German engineers didn't realize they needed to solve. The tank itself was unremarkable in many ways, just one of 49,324 produced, built in an Ohio locomotive factory by workers who'd probably never seen combat. Shipped overseas, assigned to a tank company. Given a name by its crew. War, Daddy 2. What it represented was devastating to German confidence, proof that Germany had already lost the industrial war even as fighting continued. That American productive capacity could not be matched regardless of German technical sophistication or tactical skill. The German officers who first examined that captured Sherman in the Tunisian desert probably didn't understand what they were looking at. Not really. They saw an enemy tank. Adequate armor, decent gun, nothing particularly impressive. They didn't see decades of American automotive innovation, mass production expertise refined through building millions of civilian vehicles, design philosophy that prioritized function over form, engineering maturity that came from feeding an entire nation's appetite for reliable transportation. They didn't see the future, where wars would be won not by the side with the best weapons, but by the side that could field the most weapons that actually worked when you needed them. By the time German engineers at Kummersdorf understood what they were really testing, it was too late. The war was already decided, not on battlefields. Not through heroic stands or brilliant tactics, but in factories, production lines, design offices, places where American engineers had quietly built something. The Germans never could. A tank that worked. Every single time. That was the lesson of war. 32, and it's a lesson that echoes through every conflict since. The weapon that shows up beats the weapon that doesn't, no matter how impressive it looks on paper.